So, left off talking about St. Augustine. The reason I'm talking about St. Augustine in reference to the principle of moral rectitude is that Augustine was the first in the Western tradition to be writing about the doctrine of just wars. Now, there are others who have advocated that there are certain rules of warfare. I mean, the ancient Greeks even had rules. There are certain things you do not do because they would be unfair or cowardly or cunning, but not showing any integrity as a warrior. The Quran forbids, for instance, targeting civilians or taking hostages or wanton destruction of buildings even during time of war. Okay. Well, Augustine is drawing upon not only biblical sources, but certainly drawing heavily upon Plato, Book 1 of the Republic, and other instances, in coming up with what's called the just war theory. And the just war theory is it's an important part of any contemporary discussion about whether use of military force is justified. And increasingly, because throughout the country we have highly militarized police departments, it's a question also of the degree to which the use of force is justified in resolving civil difficulties. Okay. For one thing, to begin, war should never be glorified. Okay? One reason why Hitler thought he would never have to invade the United States is because he thought we were, and this is, you can look this up, I'm not making this up, Hitler thought that Americans were so close to being Nazis already that we would only have to see how successful Germany was and figure out how much of what Hitler espoused was so close to what we ourselves embraced. You know, the racism, the worship of military power as if it were a sacrament. So once we get what Nazism is about, we'll come right over. Hemingway echoed this notion in his book Farewell to Arms, where Hemingway was himself an ambulance driver during the Spanish Civil War, which was a civil war to stop fascism in Spain. But as a volunteer ambulance driver in the Spanish Civil War, he drew upon his experiences in his novels. And at one point, a character asks an American, "Are there many fascists in America?" And the American says, "They don't know they are. But when the day comes, they'll come around quickly enough." Okay? Very discouraging and disheartening observation. But certainly not the first to make that observation. Well, don't glorify war. War is evil. If it's a necessary evil, then you do it as cleanly as you can. You do it when it's necessary. You do it as well as possible. You do it in a way that is constrained by acknowledging your goals and your values, but you do not simply go to war because war is a keen thing. Once we start believing that war is a keen thing, Augustine said, look, if Christians start believing that they can go to war just because war is a glorious thing, then we become the Romans. And this tension between Jerusalem and Rome, if you will. Rome will have won. We'll be worshiping Jupiter and calling him Jehovah. So, don't glorify war. If you're glorifying war, that by itself makes the morality of what you're doing highly suspicious. War should be a last resort. Not your first response, but a last resort. War is what you do when all else fails. Because let's face it, war is morally, it's moral quicksand. Kinds of things that we don't do in everyday life or don't allow in everyday life because they would be disastrous, because they would cause society to fall down around our ears. Those things are actually called for and encouraged in war. You lie, you cheat, you kill, you deceive, you steal if necessary. You do all kinds of things that would make society entirely dysfunctional. You do it in times of war because that's how you defeat the enemy. So understanding the mess, the moral mess that war is, you don't wander into it unnecessarily. It's a last resort when all else has failed. When not going to war will cause greater evil than going to war, then it's justified. But if there's something else you could have done to rectify the wrong you're addressing or to prevent the possible future wrong that you're addressing, something else you could have done, then the war is not justified and the war is morally objectionable. Has to be constituted by a due authority, and that's historically a little dubious. I mean, who was the due authority when the American colonists revolted against England? Well, the due authority was the British government and the king. And some wars are actually fought to say, you know what, we no longer accept the due authority. The idea which would be particularly interesting to Plato is you don't want to simply empower angry mobs to go out and do random violence and do it in the name of war. Because you're opening Pandora's box when you do that. Must be the lesser evil. Okay, we basically mentioned that. Otherwise, there's no justification for doing it. It must be pursued by proportionate means. What does that mean? Proportionate means is you use as much force and do as much harm as is necessary to accomplish the legitimate ends of the war. Beyond that, any destruction, any use of force, any harm is unjustified. Even if the war was justified to begin with, excessive force may make it unjustified. Okay, again, apply that domestically now. Was this police officer justified in arresting this individual? Yes. Was he justified in using force? Maybe. He may have been justified in using force. Was he justified in drawing his gun and shooting an unarmed person? Wait a minute. Maybe not. Maybe not. It's not that if you have reason to use force that you have reason to use disproportionate force. You've probably heard the number of Americans killed in Vietnam during that 10-year period of America fighting in Vietnam was around 50,000. Within a few thousand of the number of people killed at the Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War. That's a lot of people. Now, most Americans have never heard the number of people, the number of Vietnamese who were killed in that same war. And most neutral third parties observing the data say that probably around 4 million Vietnamese were killed. Most Americans are totally unaware of that. 4 million Vietnamese died. You'd better really have a good reason for doing this war, carrying it on for 10 years, for ending up with 4 million Vietnamese dead. Not just some flimsy grounds, not just some hypothetical grounds. You better have damn good reason for killing 4 million people. This is puzzling to many Americans at the time. We were saying, why is the world accusing us of genocide? We don't commit genocide. We're the good guys. Well, everybody thinks they're the good guys. Oh yeah, that again. And I've known Vietnam vets who have gone back to Vietnam in since the 90s or later, and have said that they felt totally betrayed. The amount of harm that they were called upon to do, the amount of harm that was done to themselves and their comrades. Said we did that to prevent by 10 years the creation of this society. This society is actually people live reasonably well. It's kind of a situation where if you do not challenge the government's authority, you'll probably be left alone. Why was I fighting here? Why was I suffering like this? And why was I inflicting all this harm? For the sake of trying to delay the establishment of this government. The United States currently supports far more heinous governments than this one. Well, okay, now whether you agree or not with that description of contemporary Vietnam, it illustrates the point, does it not? You use proportional force. You ask yourself, what is it am I trying to accomplish? Am I using an appropriate amount of force to accomplish that? Or am I using disproportional force? The American College of Bishops, a few decades ago actually, issued a joint letter saying that nuclear war is, by definition, immoral. That's simply because of the great amount of harm that it does, but because there is no end you could legitimately say would make the use of nuclear arms proportional. Different situation at the end of World War II, and that can be debated by reasonable, decent people. The bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, particularly since documents that were classified in World War II became declassified automatically in the 1990s. And many of them show that what Truman was discussing with his War Department was very largely the fact that they were convinced, on the basis of very good evidence, that Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was going to invade Western Europe. As soon as the World War II was concluded, Stalin would start World War III by invading Western Europe. And what we have to do, they thought, is scare the bejesus out of Stalin, or at least out of his entourage, if he's not a sufficiently sane man, to scare people in the Soviet Union enough to realize that they don't dare try to invade Western Europe if we can use these kinds of weapons against them. Okay, well, all right, so was it proportionate force? Now let me give you another example that is going to set even less well with a contemporary American audience. What about terrorism? Is terrorism unjust war? Well, if you take Warfare 101, theory and practice of warfare or whatever, at a military college, one of the first things you'll learn is, first of all, wars are always fought for political ends. All wars are political. Second, the goal of your strategy is to destroy the enemy's will to resist. The enemy has to want to get to a point where they say, that's enough, I can't take any more. Now, the goal of terrorism is you have disproportionate forces. You have, you've got the superpower on the one hand, and you've got insurgents on the other hand. Ragtag insurgents. Okay, as the CIA analyst put it. They feel like, yeah, we can't, if fighting symmetrical warfare, we can't go toe-to-toe with you and win, or even last for very long. But what we can do is, through guerrilla tactics, which you are going to call terrorism, we can inflict enough pain on you that you decide you have to stop something that you're doing. That you have to be willing to negotiate with us. Okay? And if you're fighting insurgents in their own homeland, such as in Vietnam, such as in Iraq, you're fighting insurgents in their own homeland. Afghanistan, even more so than Iraq, you're going to have a tough time actually getting them to the point where they say it's not worth our fighting anymore. Okay. So is terrorism ever proportional force? Given the doctrine of just wars and given the notion of proportional force, if you have a legitimate end that you're aiming at, and this is the only means by which you can accomplish it, it would generally be considered, it is considered by many people in the modern world to be a legitimate strategy. As the saying goes, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Did the American colonists use guerrilla tactics against the British? Sure. Did we use terror tactics against Germany in World War II? Yeah, actually we did. Some of the fire bombings carried out, particularly by British forces, were intended simply to cause so much pain to the civilian population, not military damage, but pain to the civilian population, that it would kill the will of the German people to resist. So that often backfires. Okay, so it all seems pretty complicated when you try to actually apply it. So what's the purpose of this whole list of characteristics of a just war? What's the use of this formula? What is the use of this principle of moral rectitude, of constrain yourself from doing harm? It gives you a starting point. It gives you an agenda to talk about. It's way better than just calling names or flailing in the dark. You have something to talk about. And what you say can be subjected to, to the rule of evidence. Do you have evidence for what you say? Does the evidence back what you're saying, what you're suggesting, what you want to do? Okay. Well, if all that's made you uncomfortable, why shouldn't philosophy make you uncomfortable? Philosophy is an attempt to uncover your most basic assumptions, your most basic values and beliefs, to hold them up to the light of day, to take them apart and see what they're made of, to give a fair hearing to alternatives, and to consider that what you have previously believed may not be the last word on the subject. Okay, and that can be discomforting. And for that reason, they killed Socrates. Well, alrighty. In the case of Socrates, it's a matter of how does this apply here? It's a matter of, you are telling me that the jury has harmed me, or that Athens has harmed me. And if they've harmed me, I therefore have the right to break the law. So no, that's not plausible. If I've suffered a wrong, that doesn't give me a right to turn around and inflict another wrong. If I think I have been wronged, then whatever I do in response has got to be constrained by my desire to behave in a just manner. I don't simply have a wild card to do what I please, even if I have been wronged. Okay, last principle is the principle of just agreements. Some people see moral rectitude as a corollary to the first principle, rational reflection, and then just agreements as a corollary to moral rectitude. I don't think that it's necessarily persuasive to see them that way, but they are certainly connected. They interlock, if you will. They're mutually supporting. Principle of just agreements has two sides. People who talk about the Crito very often neglect the second side, and in doing so come up with, I think, an utterly implausible view of Socrates regarding the law. Right? You'll hear any number of scholars say, well, Socrates believes you have to follow the law no matter what, under any circumstances. You never have any right to break the law. That, I personally, not to be rude, but I personally think that's rubbish. If Socrates believed that, he wouldn't be in jail. He would have gone into court and said, you know, I will do whatever you decide. If you tell me to stop practicing philosophy, I'll stop practicing philosophy because, after all, that is my duty to do whatever the court tells me. Instead of that, he goes into court and he says, you know, I have to follow my conscience. I have to follow my best judgment in this. And if the court tells me I have to stop philosophizing, I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to stop. Do what you think you have to do about it, but I'm not going to stop. Okay. Earlier in his life, when he thought the people in charge of Athens, basically if there was a coup or something, and the people who were running Athens did not have any legitimate authority to do so, he would simply refuse to obey their edicts. He didn't say, grab your weapons, grab a torch, let's run out into the streets and run amok. No, he said, look, I'm simply not going to obey. If you don't have legitimate authority, I'm not going to obey. Okay, and of course I mentioned before, but Gandhi and Tolstoy, Martin Luther King, so forth, mentioned Socrates by name as the inventor of nonviolent non-cooperation as a means of social change. Gandhi put it very succinctly. He said, you know, millions of Indians cannot be controlled by 100,000 British, who are 100,000 British in India. They can't control millions of Indians unless the Indians are cooperating. And Gandhi's view was all we have to do is simply stop cooperating with the British. And as long as we're not cooperating, there's not a thing they can do about it. Okay. Now, of course, it didn't pan out to be quite that simple. But the principle that we can try to affect social change through nonviolent non-cooperation, we just won't play the game if you're going to rig the game. That is a very important moral principle. Okay, so do you always have to obey the law? Well, let's begin by talking about just agreements. Just agreements, principle of just agreements, as I said, is two-sided. The first part is just agreements are obligatory. If you make a just agreement, you are under an obligation to keep it, all things being equal. And that does not mean that there are no exceptions. Remember, I mentioned the example in Book 1 of the Republic about what if you made a just agreement with your neighbor that you would return the weapon to him, and then he went stark raving mad. The context has changed. The circumstances have changed. And you might want to make an exception, even though you had a just agreement. Okay, now, the term just, and we don't want to be Euthyphro defining piety here, right? We want to get circular and take everything for granted. What makes it a just agreement? Well, he's explicit. Okay? For an agreement to be just, first of all, you have to know what you're agreeing to. It can't be put so obscurely that you had no idea what you were agreeing to. Up until, I believe it was the 1970s, there were attorneys, some of whom I knew personally, whose job it was to take simple user agreements or loan agreements or whatever and to translate them into such arcane gobbledygook. The idea was that the consumer will not know what they're agreeing to and what rights they're giving up. And then most states passed laws against that and said it has to be in plain English such that anyone with a certain reading level would be able to figure out what it meant. That's why you always have these, click on terms of service. And terms of service may seem very explicit, obvious, and boring, and hence many people don't bother to read the terms of service, but they're required to be explicit and clear. Otherwise, you don't know what you're agreeing to. Okay, so we got to know what we're agreeing to, which also means you have to be in your right mind when you make the agreement. You can't be drunk or hallucinating or unconscious or whatever. Most states will say that below a certain age level, you are not capable of actually giving consent because you're not going to be cognitively sophisticated enough to know what it is you're agreeing to. Okay. So, a just agreement, however, is an obligation. Imagine a world in which no one's word was any good. Nobody felt any obligation to keep their word. Well, that would be a very, very difficult world to live in. When we study Kant, we'll look at that more carefully. But essentially, wow, I mean, why would anybody ever bother to make a promise if nobody ever felt the obligation to keep a promise? Okay? If you couldn't trust anybody's word, then you live in a sort of a very adversarial situation. Okay, the other side is that unjust agreements are never obligatory. You are never obligated, morally obligated, to keep an unjust agreement. What would make an unjust agreement, an agreement unjust? Well, first of all, if it involves some kind of injustice. Okay. If I solemnly swear, I'm conscious, I understand what I'm saying, but what I'm agreeing to is to commit a crime, that doesn't carry any moral weight because what I was agreeing to was immoral to begin with. Okay. If it's made coercively, no just agreement can be made coercively. If you put a gun to my head and make me agree to something, that doesn't carry any moral weight at all. Okay, you may have heard of the principle of unenforceable contracts. If you're pre-law, you probably at some point will hear about it. Unenforceable contract means that the contract itself was unenforceable because it was illegal to begin with. There was an old so-called reality show. The reality shows were never really reality, but there was an old reality show called Cops that was very popular, a notorious episode where a police officer is flagged down by a woman who's pointing at another woman and saying, "Arrest her, arrest her." The other woman who's sitting on the steps of the building is yelling, "She's crazy, she's crazy." "Well, arrest her." "Okay, ma'am," the officer says. "Why do you want me to arrest her?" "I gave her $50 to give me something, and she didn't give it to me, and she won't give me my $50 back." "$50, ma'am, would that be crack cocaine?" "Yeah, but she didn't give it to me, and she won't give me my money back." The woman sitting on the steps yelling, "She's crazy," she says. I am not the coke dealer. The coke dealer moved out of here weeks ago. I'm a prostitute." And the poor officer just looks like, why did I get out of bed this morning? Okay, what's the purpose of that story? The purpose of that story is just to illustrate this. You can't call a police officer and say, "Hey, she didn't give me the cocaine I paid for." The law is not going to enforce that contract. Okay? Take her to small claims court. Excuse me, that's not going to work because the agreement wasn't legal to begin with. Well, likewise, if it's if you're violating moral rules by making this agreement to begin with, if you're agreeing to do something immoral, then it doesn't matter that you had a conscious, voluntary, clear agreement to do it. It's morality does not enforce an unjust agreement. So, of course, Socrates clearly does not believe that you always have an obligation to obey the law. You have the obligation to obey the law if you have a just agreement with the law. Okay? We can use the term social contract, which will come into popularity later in Western thought, but essentially that's what Socrates is talking about, a social contract. Look, it's like a contract. Athens has certain obligations to me as an Athenian citizen, and I, in turn, have certain obligations to Athens. If Athens keeps their side of the bargain, I'm obligated to keep mine, as long as the social contract is itself a just agreement. Okay? So, now if you pay me $1,000 to come and fix your sidewalk, I agree, I'll do it. before December. December 1st rolls around, and I show up on your front steps, and I say, "Will you pay me? You pay me that $1,000 you owe me?" You'll say, "I don't owe you $1,000. You agreed you'd pay me." Well, no, I agree. I'd pay you to fix the sidewalk before December 1st, but it's December 1st has come and gone, and you haven't shown up and fixed the sidewalk. I don't owe you any money. Okay, it's a reciprocal agreement. Most contracts, business contracts, legal contracts of any kind, are reciprocal agreements. In many cultures, including some traditional cultures, not just contemporary cultures, the marriage contract is a reciprocal agreement. We both agree that this is how we're going to behave. If one of us doesn't behave in that way, then the other one is relieved for the obligations of staying in that contract. Hence, you can get divorced. Okay. Traditional Islamic custom says a woman may divorce her husband for exactly those reasons. He's unkind. He doesn't do his duty as a husband to provide for the family. Whatever. If a woman can divorce her husband because he's not upholding the social contract. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that every culture that calls itself Islamic, or in which Islam is the majority religion, upholds that kind of agreement, but that kind of view of the marriage contract. But if you go back to Muhammad, that's exactly what the marriage contract is. It's a reciprocal contract. In our culture, we traditionally have had this notion of marriages are made in heaven. God has foreordained that you two would be together, and there's nothing you can do about it. Once you're together, there's not a thing, especially if you're the woman, there's nothing you can do about it. We might ask, does that view of the marriage contract expedite any good whatsoever? We'll study later, we're studying utilitarianism, and note that Karl Marx and his associate Friedrich Engels said that the marriage contract in what was for them their contemporary society, 19th century England, 19th century Europe, was essentially a relationship of monopoly ownership of another person's genitalia. Okay, oh, that's brutal. Yeah, but did law and custom reduce it to nothing more than that? If it's a reciprocal contract, then everybody's got rights. Everybody has the right to say this contract is not in effect anymore because you haven't upheld your side of it. Okay, so this all gets down to, for Socrates, do I have a social contract with Athens? Yes, I do. Is that social contract a just agreement? He says, yes, it is. I've always said that these laws were the best in any Greek city-state. And I would be lying if I said I didn't think it was a good set of laws or a good legal system. I think it is. Is it perfect? No, of course it's not perfect. Will it always come up with the best results? No. But is it possible to achieve what you want to achieve in this legal system? Well, if the answer is more often than not, although it's not perfect, it is actually very good, then if that's what you believe, then you can't say, well, the law is unfair, the laws are unjust. Socrates didn't believe that. He said, look, I'd be a hypocrite. All my life, I've praised the laws of Athens, and here I am now saying that now that the law has gone against me, that the law is rotten. My first philosophy professor used to talk about what a miracle rule by law is. So two people go into court. Each one thinks the other one is a jerk. Each one thinks I'm right and you're wrong. They present their evidence. The judge or the jury, hearing the evidence, decides who's in the right. The judge referees to make sure that everybody behaves appropriately under the law. and then the judgment is rendered. And yes, there may be a certain number of appeals prescribed by law, but when those appeals are done, that's it. You have to abide by what the courts say. Now, does that mean that one party's going to walk away from that court saying, how do you like that? I was wrong the whole time. I would never have guessed. No, he's going to walk away grumbling under his breath and saying, yeah, the judge is an idiot and the laws are awful and blah, 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 and complaining in the usual kinds of way. But both parties will abide by the law. What's the alternative to that? The alternative is we simply use force to do what we please. Force, coercion, fraud, deceit, all those are allowed if we are not going to allow ourselves to be ruled by law. Giving up rule by law is a very, very serious step, okay? Basically, you're bringing down the house on top of your head. Socrates said, no, I don't think the Athenian laws are bad. I don't think the Athenian court system is bad. Was I given a fair trial? I was allowed to conduct my defense as I pleased. So I can't very well complain now. I was given the opportunity to suggest an alternative penalty, which is prescribed by law. If you're convicted of a capital crime, you get to suggest an alternative penalty. And as I mentioned before, I said no. I would be betraying my principles if I said that I deserved to be kicked out of Athens for teaching philosophy. In fact, what actually happens is kind of endearing and amusing. He says, well, okay, if you think these people whose sons have been my companions in philosophy, that these people have been the wrong party, let me go ask the party you allege I have wronged. What do they think I deserve? Okay, now you notice that people will defend their children, will defend their sons in this case, as they would defend their most precious property, and yet these people are here on my behalf, not to accuse me. Although you say I've damaged their sons. So let me, if they are the party that's been wronged, let me go, the parties that have been wronged, let me go ask them what they think I deserve. And he goes and confers with them. And he comes back and he says, well, they said instead of putting me to death, what you ought to do is give me a pension. Imagine if you had a sufficiently smart judge, quick-witted, and sufficiently uncomfortable with this whole proceeding. Imagine he had said, okay, a pension. You are hereby sentenced to receive a pension. Case closed. And don't you dare bring this case back into this court again, you sophists who have accused him, because we have made our judgment. Wow, wouldn't history be different? But the judge, the court feels insulted by that suggestion. So they say, we won't accept that as an alternative penalty. So he goes and he chats with his friends again. He comes back and he says, well, they suggested perhaps for your trouble, for your inconvenience, that I pay a fine of such and so forth an amount. Not an extreme amount. He said, yeah, I don't know that I've got that cash on hand, but Plato and the boys, they're loaded. They'll cover it for me. Again, the court won't accept that. Because essentially you're saying, the most wrong I've done is to cause you a little inconvenience. Nothing else. It's a rejection of the decision of the court. Now Socrates says, I received a fair trial. I believe the jury made a mistake. But that doesn't mean my trial was unfair. There was a PBS series called Downton Abbey. At one point, the butler is in jail. He's been accused of murder. He's innocent of the crime. When his wife goes to visit him, she's appalled. How could anyone believe that you were guilty of this? And he said, well, the way the case was presented, if I had been on the jury, I might have convicted the defendant too. I mean, we know that I didn't do it. But I understand why they mistakenly thought that I did. Okay? No system of justice is ever going to be perfect. You have human judgment being involved. Socrates in a dialogue called, or Plato in a dialogue called the Laws says, look, laws should be made by elected legislators. If they're elected, first of all, you can limit the number of terms that they'll be in office, so you don't get entrenched special interests in your legislature, and you can hold them accountable. If they make bad laws, they'll lose their jobs. And you'll have to keep revising the laws, getting rid of some of them, making new ones. Why is that? Well, because laws will only be as good as the people who made them, and none of these people making the laws are going to be perfect people. So expect there will be imperfections. Does that mean that, well, gee, I don't have to follow those laws because they're not perfect? I don't have to abide by the decisions of the jury because the judicial system isn't perfect? You might as well just say, let's not have laws and let's not have a judicial system if you say that. If you cannot ask for loyalty to a political system unless it is perfect, then you can't ask for loyalty to any political system, and that means basically you'll have anarchy, not in the romanticized notion of anarchy where we're sitting under trees, playing reggae songs to each other and living in peace and harmony, but anarchy as in, violence, arson, and looting. Okay. Well, has Athens kept its end of the deal? Yeah, and he just goes down the line. The law provided that I had to be educated, and I was. It provided the context for my parents to be married and have a family, and it did. The law provided for this, for that. They kept their end of it. If I thought that any of the laws needed to be changed, I had the same right as any other citizen to go before the public forum and argue for changes in the laws. And I never did that because I never actually thought that was required. Well, what's happening is he's saying, look, it's not perfect. I think they made a mistake, but somebody has to have the authority to make the call, even if they're not making the call perfectly. Okay? Imagine a basketball game in which the referees had no, shows how sports-minded I am, in which the referees did not have the authority to call fouls. Now, every basketball player I've known, and yes, I have known a number of them, has said sometimes the referees will make bad calls. They'll make unless the guy is totally biased, in which case he'll probably lose his job. He's going to make some bad calls that go against your team, and he's going to make some bad calls from which your team benefits. But he's going to make a good effort, and he's probably going to be most of the time right. The fans might be booing him, but remember, he was standing a lot closer, and he could see things a lot better than the fans could see them. You hit the ball in a baseball game, you slide into first base, you get tagged because the first baseman gets the ball just about the time you get there. I've probably gotten something wrong about the rules of baseball, but it's hypothetical. The umpire says, "You're out." And the baseball player stands up and says, "Who do you think you are?" "I don't believe I'm out." "That's not my truth." "Well, believe what you want, but you're out. I'm the umpire. I don't care who you are. I'm staying right here on first base. You could not play the game. The game can't go on unless somebody has the ability to make the call." A good manager, I've been fortunate to have good managers. I've also been cursed to have really dreadfully bad managers sometimes. A good manager does a number of things, one of which is you listen to your team. You make the decision and you're responsible for the decision, but you listen to your team. You ask for their input, you consider it, and you say, okay, thank you all very much. I've heard your viewpoints, I've heard your suggestions. Here's what I've decided is what we're going to do. Once you decide that, a good team will then get on board and say, okay, well, it's the manager's call. It may not be the call I would have made, but it's the manager's call. Now we've got to make our best effort to make that decision work. Okay? I can't believe I'm using sport. Anybody who knows me well is be just amazed that you're using sports analogies. Yeah, well, why not? Use whatever analogies work. So you're asking me now, Socrates says, you're asking me now essentially to go into voluntary exile by breaking the law. The jailbreak would be breaking the law. And I would be living outside of Athens. Can't take my children with me. If I did somehow get them out, take them with me, they would lack an Athenian upbringing, which I think is a real tremendous advantage. They'd be mocked for being the children of that jailbird Socrates, that fugitive from the law. Would not be doing my children any favor by doing as you say. Doing my friends any favor? Aha, look, Socrates was guilty. You were defending a guilty man. If he were really the man he said he was, he would not now be hiding out in Thessaly, a refugee from Athenian law. Well, Socrates says, I can do one thing that my accusers could not do. I can make myself guilty. How would I be making myself guilty? They accuse me of being an enemy of the laws and a corrupter of youth. If I take your suggestion, Crito, then I am both. Okay, now this is not a cause-effect argument. He's not saying, okay, people will be running amok in Athens within a week if I break out of jail. What he's saying is something that has to do with, go back to the principle of rational reflection. Can I universalize the principle I would have to embrace to justify what I'm doing? The principle I would have to embrace to justify what I'm doing if I accept the jailbreak offer is that when your moral obligation comes into conflict with your personal self-interest, forget your moral obligations and just look out for yourself. If that were universalized, that would destroy the laws. That would destroy the city. And if, by example, I taught that conduct, I would be the corrupter of youth. And you bet people are watching very carefully, particularly the young men who admire Socrates are watching carefully to see what is Socrates going to actually do here? Because we consider him to be a role model, so what's he going to do? Well, he's got to play that through to the end. I'm going to stand my ground, I'm not going to compromise my principles, and I'm not going to break the law. Okay, now when he was in court, he told the court, if you put me in a position where I have on the one hand my own conscience and, as far as I can understand it, the will of the gods, and I have on the other hand the law, the judgment of the court, and I can't do both at once, I have to choose one, I'm going to go with my conscience and the gods, not with the judgment of the court. So don't put me in that position if you don't want that outcome. In other words, I'm caught in a situation where, in the court, where I can't accept the judgment of the court and recant philosophy unless I violate my own conscience and do something that I think violate what I think is a much higher obligation. I have to choose between my conscience and the law. Well, now that he is in jail and facing execution, he does not have that conflict. I can stand by my principles and I can respect the law. I can do both at once. I don't have to choose between them. But the only way I can do that is to be willing to put up or shut up. I have to be willing to take my stand and give my life for my principles, as I always said I was willing to do. As a young man, I risked my life for Athens many times. What a fool I would be to, now as an old man, say, with only a little life left, say, oh no, that's too precious, I can't risk my life for Athens. Of course, If need be, I will sacrifice my life for my principles and for Athens. So that sort of brushes aside all of the arguments that Crito has made. And he says, you know, I can hear he makes a reference to mystical music from religious ceremonies. And he says, you know, metaphorically, the music is so loud, I don't even hear anything you're saying. In other words, Crito, you have no argument. You have nothing to say. So give it up. He is actually willing to lay down his life for the welfare of his friends, his associates, and for Athens.